And Teresa, I'm going to have my name on the CEU certificate since you're an LPCI. So I'll contribute an introduction. Our wonderful LPCI, Teresa, is going to be doing two talks on diversity. I know y'all have heard this before. We've had several discussions, the two of us, and we are attempting to not just account for diversity via talks, but also try to make real life and practical steps towards that. And so we will be learning not only necessarily diversity within the workplace, within a mental health facility, but also working with diverse clients over the next couple of CEUs. Teresa, you can present and take it away. And you can unmute.
I'm so nervous.
You're killing it.
So, okay, yeah. So, thank you guys for having me. I am a little nervous. I have presented before, not particularly, not on this particular subject, but here I am. So, like Josh said, he and I have had a couple of conversations about diversity and expanding, and I'm also working to share my screen here. Um, Yeah, so I will pull this up and jump right into it. Can everybody see that? See the screen? I can't see anybody.
Yes. We
Okay. Okay, awesome. Okay, so diversity in practice, culturally diverse mental health services that are inclusive. And one of the reasons we're doing this, like Josh said, is because the Timothy Center wants to expand its base. And so, in order to do that, we need to know a little bit about what that looks like. So, there's a term, I don't know if you guys have seen it, it's called BOC. This is a fairly new term. It popped up around 2013. It has become more popular. People are using it more with everything that's going on as far as police brutality and Black Lives Matter, and things like that. The American Counseling Association has actually using this. They also dedicated July for Mental Health Month for people of color, and they're also using this term. So a little bit of background about this term. So BOC is an acronym that stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. Black can refer to dark-skinned people of Africa, Oceania, and Australia, or their descendants, in regard to the lightness or darkness of their skin tone, who were enslaved by white people. Indigenous here refers to ethnic groups native to America who were killed in the masses by white people. People of color is an umbrella term for non-white people. And one of the reasons why they started to kind of use this term to see how it would work, or to kind of umbrella everyone, because there were people in Canada that weren't slaves, people in the US were known as Black people who had been slaves. And so this term is supposed to be an umbrella that kind of covers everybody. So that's a little background about that. And also, when working with people of color, it's really important to understand how we want to be addressed. Um, I prefer African American. Some people prefer Black. And then you have Hispanics, Latinx, Mexican. And so it's just really understanding what that culture is and how people of color want to be addressed and by what term. And it's best to just ask. So some background terms that we all know, but we're going to run through them, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Diversity, the quality or state of having many different forms, types, or ideas. The state of having people who are different races or who have different cultures in a group or an organization. Um, who have different cultures in a group. So when we think of people of color, right, that could be different cultures within a group. Because I'm dark skinned does not necessarily mean I'm from Africa, or I could be Puerto Rican or Dominican. Um, and so it's just understanding regions and cultures, and just a little bit about diversity. Inclusion, the act or practice of including and accommodating people who have historically been excluded um, because of their race, gender, or sexuality. Culture, of or relating to a particular group of people and their habits, beliefs, and traditions, or relating to the fine arts. And so this goes back to that umbrella, right, of culture, where we're talking about whether it's music, food, or um, just different activities that define that group's culture. And then mental health, right? We're all in mental health. The condition of being sound mentally and emotionally that is characterized by the absence of mental health and by adequate adjustment, especially as reflected in feeling comfortable about oneself, positive feelings about others, and the ability to meet the demands of daily life. And that demand is going to look different for everyone. It's going to look different culturally. It's going to look different in a family system. Also, the general condition of one's mental and emotional state. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about ethics. We've all read the ACA ethics, and now I'm just going to do a little recap of some of those. Um, Developmental and cultural sensitivity. And this is where we, as clinicians, when we talk about including other cultures, this is where we're aware of the type of language that we're using. This is where we're aware, say, for instance, if we have a Hispanic family, being able to communicate if they don't speak English, being able to understand what that system looks like. I've worked in a disadvantaged school with a high population of Hispanic kids where the kids are translating for the parents. So being able to have that conversation, even if it means having an interpreter, which of course there is a confidentiality situation involved in that, and privacy. Um, Being able to collaborate with clients when we're talking about when we're not just talking about the informed consent, but we're talking about treatment plans and things like that, and making sure that it fits into that value system of the family, personal values. Um, Avoiding having some of our own values imposed upon that family system. And that means even checking our own biases and how we feel about certain things that are even going on, in the world today. Roles and relationships um, and individual levels. And this is where we are, as a Timothy Center, where this was actually A7A, where it talks about later, because I think that sometimes we do forget that advocacy, the ACA tells us to advocate, right? Advocate. So we hear about disparities in mental health for marginalized groups. So what are we doing about that? Well, we are having this particular training. The center is opening up. So that's one way. But just keeping that in mind on how we can reach out into communities and advocate. Um, to decrease those disparities for mental health. And then non-discrimination, where we just really try not to discriminate, right? Whether we're doing assessments, whether they're walking in the door, or it's not a whole lot I can say about discrimination, just non-discrimination. We want to really keep a check on that. and make people of color feel welcome. Section E, evaluation, assessment, and interpretation. This is where, of course, we are making sure that we are assessing people of color with the correct assessments. And we'll talk a little bit more about this because sometimes people of color display depression symptoms a little bit differently. It may be a pain, it may be an ache. There's been, history shows there's been a lot of misdiagnosis or overassessments, especially I've seen it a lot in schools where maybe the kid, there's some trauma and we're seeing it that way because the kid is displaying it in a different way. And even adults is really having a hard time, of people of color having a hard time describing what those symptoms are that don't really look like what we learn they are in the DSM-5. So now that we went through the background and we've looked at ethics, mental health, culture, inclusion, diversity, how do we tie it all together? Now we want to talk about how to provide culturally diverse mental health services that are inclusive. We're going to talk a little bit about some statistics first. Only 36% of Hispanics with depression receive care versus whites. Only 8.6% of Asian Americans sought any type of resources for mental illness. And in 2008, only 58.2% of Black and African Americans aged 18 to 25 and 50.1% aged 26 to 49 with serious mental illness did not receive treatment. Also, there was a study done in 2007 where between the ages of 18 and 24, I think there was like a 40 something percent of young African American men committing suicide that had received absolutely no mental illness treatment at all, or even sought out any type of care. This is just another chart that goes on to explain some of those numbers, where 41.8%, 89,000 young adults with substance abuse and mental illness. Here we see 58% got no treatment. And then between the ages of 26 and 49, 50.1% received no treatment. Now we want to ask ourselves why. What are those barriers? Socioeconomic disparities, such as exclusion from mental health, education. It could be social, it could be just basic economic resources. These disparities may contribute to worsen the mental illness symptoms in people of color. Then there's stigma. 63% of African Americans believe that mental illness is a personal problem. They believe that it's personal, it's kept in the home. We don't talk about it outside the home. It's a family affair. The stigma can act as a deterrent for people needing help. Trust is another issue with everything that we see in the news because some people of color think that white people can't possibly understand what they're going through, or how can I even start that conversation? Um, then there's mixed diagnosis. So when we talk a little bit about misdiagnosis, African Americans may describe body aches and pains when talking about depression. Sounds just like a medical condition. And that's because sometimes we have problems describing what that sadness is. Because sadness isn't really an illness, right? We feel down, get up, go to work, we're sustaining, we're surviving. And that's pretty much what it's equated to. Let's see. And then provider lack of cultural competence. And this is where the provider, so we learn this stuff in school, but are we really doing it in our sessions? There's been instances where people of color has went to sessions and didn't feel like they were being heard, or the clinician said something insensitive and then they just didn't go back. So here, this is where I kind of wanted to talk to you guys and give you an example. And this is, and I've kind of talked to Josh a little bit about this, but this is a true story, really happened. Um, I was an intern. There was an incident where a mother was upset about a particular skill that her son was being, well, it wasn't the skill that was being taught, it was the conversation. So it was a DBT skill. Uh, it was the dear man. Mother was upset. And really, what this boiled down to is that yes, the skill makes sense, but not in the context of that particular family system. Because in an African American home, we don't negotiate. There's no room for negotiating. It just doesn't happen. And so this mom was really upset um, because she felt like just from what I heard from the conversation, felt like the clinician was kind of overstepping. Um, but if we understand the cultural context of where she was coming from and the family system and how the system is set up, and the things that go on in the home or how we raise our children, and then let me go further and give a further example of that. When I say not negotiating and I say no room for negotiating, using myself as a further example, there's no room for negotiating in our home because I can't negotiate with my kid on whether or not he wears a hoodie. I can't negotiate with my kid on how late he stays out. I can't negotiate with my kid on how he responds if he's stopped by the police. So we just don't do it. Our homes are not run as a democracy. And so when we talk about modifying skills, we want to talk about addressing that in the context of that family system and how that family operate and runs on those values and that particular culture. Um, in this particular situation, as an intern, I think it stayed with me. It's been almost a year, and I think it stayed with me for two reasons. As a clinician, did I say enough or do enough or have a conversation with my supervisor about it? Was I part of the problem in creating that disparity? Was I part of the problem? Did that mom either further seek care for her son? So was I part of the problem? I had to look at myself too. Um, it was a learning experience to teach culture, to teach how family systems are different. Um, and so we just want to be mindful of when we're teaching certain skills, if they're being modified and applied in a culturally appropriate way. Uh, and then I want to go on to explain just a little bit more about that particular situation, because we talk a lot about the iceberg and we talk a lot about primary and secondary emotions. Um, so I put myself kind of in that mom's shoes because her emotion was anger. She was livid. So if we look at what those primary emotions were, was she depressed? Was she depressed because of something going on in society? Was she depressed because there's a double standard in her life? Uh, she's a black female. Fear for her son because she doesn't want to have this conversation with him. Because there's an inner conflict with trying to protect her son and her son just trying to be independent. And then justifiable anger because she felt like what she had told her kid was being diminished, or her authority was being diminished, threatened? Did she feel like the rules that she had set down was being threatened? Did she feel like her family system was being threatened? Then sadness. Was she sad because she even had to be there? Because we know, because if we know how people of color think about getting mental illness help or getting the therapy that they need, was she sad to even be there? Was she sad because her family was giving her a hard time about putting her son in therapy? Did she feel disrespected because she felt like the therapist had kind of crossed the line? Was she annoyed? Who knows? Maybe she had been to 3 or 4 different therapists and felt like that they just weren't hearing her, or she wasn't being validated, or her son wasn't being validated, or the situation wasn't being validated. Embarrassed again because her extended family has kind of shamed her with stigma of even seeking out help. And then the stress of being a mom of a son that's African American and all the stress that goes along with that. Was she scared? And then was she bitter? And then just tired? So there's a lot of things that we have to really look at when we're working with people of color that may present itself as anger or aggression. Um, Look at some of those underlying things that are going on to identify what that primary emotion was. Because I literally felt like she was being identified as just an angry Black woman, when really she could have had a ton of these other things going on here that she had to deal with on a daily basis. So we always want to be mindful of what those primary emotions are that have to deal with just being a person of color. And so here are some things that are kind of ineffective. Um, Doing nothing. This is when we have clients in sessions and we're just not going to do anything. We're not going to address that there's an elephant in the room. We're not going to address that they're Black or brown, or and we're just going to overlook it. Sidetracking the conversation where something sensitive is kind of brought up and we feel uncomfortable and we just want to change it. Appeasing the client, which kind of is kind of coming off as just kind of agreeing, with what they say, but not really showing, I guess, empathy, or kind of sounds patronizing. Becoming defensive because we don't necessarily agree with what the person is saying. Becoming dismissive because we don't understand it or we don't have any empathy. Treatment that does not consider culture, traditions, or values. And this is where we want to incorporate some of the, or keep in mind some of those culture values when we're coming up with treatment plans and how to approach, what's going on. I've had emails when the George Floyd situation happened. I had emails from a supervisor at another location email me, and she simply started it off with, "I don't know what to say, but I feel like if I don't say anything, that's worse." And that really touched me because I hadn't talked to her in months, but she felt the need to reach out and address it in some way. I've even had a couple of people from the Timothy Center actually reach out to me to just talk to me about the situation that was going on. Actually, when it first started, and I didn't even know the magnitude of it because I hadn't watched TV in a couple of days. But just reaching out to say, or addressing, I don't know what to say, but I'm here for you. I don't know what to say, but let's have this conversation if you need to. That's that's a way to be effective. Working with working with Black, Indigenous people of color. Take into consideration historical factors, and this could be just knowing some of that micro type of history, and and what and some of those feelings that go along with that. This could even mean just going back and reading everything that's going on in the world, because you never know the person that's going to walk through your door and what experience they have or where they're coming from. Understanding transgenerational trauma, it's a real thing. Though we can look at people of color and we can say, oh, this happened many years ago. You weren't a slave. It doesn't matter. But it really does, because it's literally passed down from generation to generation. The trauma of it is passed down from generation to generation. So understanding that, evaluating practices and theoretical approaches to align with clients' values and systems. I put this in again because this is so important. Assessing personal biases. And this is where we have to really check ourselves to make sure that we are not imposing our own values that may come across as dismissive. There's also taking the implicit bias test and doing a self check every now and then. Validating the client's experience. Doesn't mean you totally understand where they're coming from, but it means validating that they are there and they are feeling it. Examining how perceived racial discrimination may contribute to hypervigilance, anxiety, or depressive symptoms. Just imagine having a fight every day of your life and what that mentally does to a person, or having to feel like you have to defend yourself every single day. Um, and then kind of just think about how that affects the mental psyche of someone. Education goes back to that, looking at those factors. Proper screening and assessment measures, taking the time to make sure we're not over assessing, over diagnosing, paying attention to some of the symptoms that we're being told in addition to those experiences that the client is describing. Acknowledgement. Acknowledgement doesn't mean you have to agree with it. You may have different personal values, but acknowledging that this person is going through their personal experience. If talking about race makes you feel uncomfortable, that's supposed to be ask yourself why. And this is where, if it's really making you uncomfortable in a session, you might need to do a self check. Because if your client is a person of color, at some point it's going to come up. And are we prepared to have that conversation? Are we prepared to sit and listen to that experience and respond in an appropriate way? And I have some phrases to just kind of review to kind of start the kind of broaching the topic. One of the things we could say, I hear you, I see you. Um, I can't begin to understand what this must be like for you. Um, would you like for me to bring this up again in future sessions? And this is if they bring it up. I won't be hurt if you say no. Here are some options for how I can show up for you to support you. Let's brainstorm together for what that might look like. And then you come up with a list on what's comfortable for, for the client. Um, in light of everything that's going on in the world, would you like to have a conversation? We don't usually talk about race in our sessions, but I'm wondering how things are impacting you. I feel a little nervous bringing this up. I want to give you the space to talk about race and everything that has been happening in the news lately. I know that I'm white, not of your race, and can't possibly understand what you might be going through. But if you'd like to have the conversation, I want you to know that I'm open to hearing anything that you need to process right now. So these are just some broaching starter sentences to just kind of start with clients, because talking about race can be uncomfortable. Having that conversation can be uncomfortable for everybody involved. But what we know is that COVID, of course, is hitting the Black community pretty hard. Along with that large disparity that we already see, it's going to be even wider. And once we get on the other side of it, the need for mental health in the people of color community is really going to expand. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we ready to meet that demand? Are we ready to have these conversations with our clients? Um, and that's just a question, are we ready? I already went over starting the conversation. Initiate the conversation. Use acceptance. Doesn't mean you agree. And validate without personal experience about racism. Because we want to just kind of let the client just kind of have that space. Let's see. And I have questions.
That's me clapping if you can't hear.
Teresa, you had a list of phrases. Is there a way we could get that list?
Uh-huh.
I think that would be awesome if you could
Yes.
share that.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to get back to the picture here. Okay. Okay, yeah, for sure. Yes. Um, Josh, do you mind if I share my letter?
Yeah, that's awesome.
Did he leave?
I'm here. Yep, that'd be awesome.
Okay. Okay. So that was pretty much the end of the actual presentation. But I did want to share this with you guys because I think sometimes as humans, sometimes we understand things better if it is a little bit personal. I know when Josh first asked me to do this, I told him I needed a little time because I needed to put something together because I needed it to not be emotional and needed it to be factual. Um, and so being an African American woman, it's sometimes hard to kind of separate the two. But I did want to share this particular letter. I normally don't get really political and things like that, but as everything kind of evolved over this summer, I felt it weighing on me. And this is what came out of that. The daily fear of a mother of a Black son is mentally and emotionally exhausting. The state not to diminish the value of our beautiful Black daughters. It is to share that I have different fears for my children because of the color of their skin. Let me explain. My children are biracial. My daughter is lighter than my son. My son's darker complexion puts him at risk of losing his life. I started having the Black talk with my son around the age of 5 in the hopes that it would be a saving grace. What's the Black talk? There are so many, but I will name a few. The conversation where I've told them they have to go to school dressed nice so teachers don't make additional assumptions about them. The assumption that they are poor or come from broken homes. The assumption that they have absentee fathers, receive government assistance, and live in subsidized housing. I know this because I've worked in private and public schools. I have children that have attended private and public schools. I've had to tell my children they could not cognitively behave in the same manner as their white peers because the punishment would always be harsher for them. I've had to tell my children to keep their hands to themselves as we stroll through the stores to avoid being accused of shoplifting. Exclusively for my son is the hoodie talk, the dating white girls talk. That one is interesting if you know anything about me. The police talk, and it goes on. This past fall, 2019, my son was driving for a delivery service. He was stopped by a white man in an affluent neighborhood and questioned. Then there was the white lady that allowed her dog to chase him while she stood by and said nothing. And of course, he was stopped by the police and questioned as well. At what point would he be able to work a job without harassment? I worry daily because my young adult son cannot afford to make mistakes. His mistakes could cost his life or his freedom. Leaving the house could cost him his life or freedom. So I hover. Hovering causes contention and fears expressed as anger. It's all pretty exhausting. I read a post today that stated, all lives matter. Yes, all matter. I wholeheartedly know and believe that all lives matter. I believe we are all equal, but are we treated that way? Not all lives had a knee on their neck for nearly 9 minutes. So I asked this question. Do all mothers of those lives fear that every time their son leaves the house, day or night, that he may lose his life because of the color of his skin? Does every parent have the black talk with their children? I ask all my mental health peers to not let your be better and do better end with a hashtag. Go beyond the hashtag and take action. In addition to writing checks to support change, be the change. If talking about racism makes you uncomfortable, question yourself. How can we as mental health professionals counsel Black people if we cannot conceptualize their experience? Modify therapeutic interventions so that they're culturally diverse. Hire more Black therapists for their knowledge and skills. Offer diversity trainings that is taught by those that have lived those experiences. I've been having these uncomfortable conversations for a long time. Let's start having these uncomfortable conversations together to institute a change.
Teresa, thank you so much for sharing.
And I just wanted to, thank you. And I just wanted to add that because sometimes a personal experience adds a little bit to that. But we also have to in addition, understand that authentically out there, people of color, and it's on the rise. Um, it's not just for mental illness, but also just having to have conversations like these,
Mm-hmm.
just having to have lifelong conversations like this, and then take my 26-year-old son who probably could use some counseling. I can't give it to him, but look at the trust factor. He's not going to go. I've tried to get him to go. So just trying to institute, that change by being the change, by educating on like how to start really having these hard conversations because they are hard and they are uncomfortable sometimes. Um, but the need is really growing and we're really gonna see an uprise as we continue to get on the other side of COVID. And especially when we look at the amount of people that are losing their loved ones and not being able to say goodbye. Yeah, that's it. Thank you guys.
Fantastic clinical information, but potentially more importantly, touching personal story that is both eye-opening, but also brings the clinical information that you share, I think, more clarity. Anybody have any questions?
And Joey, I would get you this list. I'll type it up. And I printed it out, but I'll send it.
It appears that this is a topic that is on everybody's heart and mind, in that we've been doing the CEUs for a year and a half, and this is probably double the normal group that we have attend live. So it's an awesome turnout. I will be sending the certificate and also the evaluation. If you could return the evaluation to me. Teresa, do you yet know what August will look like, and can you give us a snippet of what that CEU will be?
So for August, it's totally different. So this was the client side, and so now we're going to talk about the employee side. That goes on to say Josh wants to expand, right? And so that means maybe hiring more people of color, or we talk about like going out to the community. And so this is going to the second part is going to be more about the employee side and working with therapists of color and what that looks like. This is more on like the treatment and having that conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. And you guys have a good rest of your day.
Thank you guys for having me. I hope it was informative.
It was.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
Teresa.
much. It was great, Teresa. And
Thank you.
and your story was really